I've always been the kind of person who likes being out in nature. Camping was my way of getting away from everything: work, stress, the noise of life. I wasn't an expert outdoorsman or anything, but I knew my way around the basics. I had a routine. I'd pack up, head out to the woods for a few days, clear my mind, and come back feeling better. That was the plan this time, too. It was early October, cool but not too cold, perfect weather for a solo camping trip. I picked a spot in a national forest in Montana, one of those places that didn't get too much foot traffic. I wasn't looking for crowded campgrounds or hiking trails packed with people. I wanted quiet, just me, my tent, my gear, and the trees. The drive out was long, about 4 hours from my home. I had everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a good knife, my rifle. Not because I expected trouble, but because it was stupid to go deep into the woods without one. Bears, mountain lions, even just a coyote getting too curious. I liked having a way to protect myself. I parked at a trailhead and started hiking in, aiming to go about 5 miles before setting up camp. The deeper I got, the quieter everything became. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional sound of an animal moving through the brush. By the time I found a good spot, it was late afternoon. I chose a small clearing near a stream, set up my tent, and got a fire going. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. It was peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I ate, sat by the fire for a while, then turned in early. I slept fine, woke up with the sunrise, and spent the day exploring. Walked a few miles, found some animal tracks, even spotted a few deer. It was exactly the kind of trip I wanted. Then, that second night, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. I was sitting by the fire when I heard movement in the trees behind me. Not unusual. The woods are full of animals, but this sounded bigger. Not a deer, though. It was slower, more deliberate, like something was stepping carefully. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the trees. Nothing, just the usual tangle of branches and leaves. I brushed it off, told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. It was like I wasn't alone anymore, like something was watching me. I tried to shake it off, ate my dinner, sat by the fire, but I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder. Every little noise made my skin crawl. Eventually, I forced myself to go to bed, but I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening. At some point in the night, I heard it again, a twig snapping, then another, not close but not far either. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining my ears. Nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, heart pounding, before finally drifting off again. The next morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. That's what being alone in the woods does to you. It makes your brain jump at every little sound. I decided to stay one more night. I shouldn't have. That day, I hiked out farther than before, trying to clear my head, but something felt wrong. The deeper I went into the woods, the more I felt like I wasn't alone. Every now and then, I'd stop and listen, and once or twice, I swore I heard something. Footsteps stopping just after mine, the faintest rustling in the trees. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just the woods, just my imagination. But when I made it back to camp that evening, something was different. My tent was open, not torn, not wrecked, just open, the zipper halfway down. My stomach dropped. I knew I hadn't left it like that. I was careful about keeping it shut to keep bugs and animals out. I walked over, heart pounding, and checked inside. Nothing was missing. My sleeping bag was still there. My food, my gear untouched. But someone had been here, or something. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. Pack up and leave? Stay one more night? I had my rifle. I wasn't defenseless. I decided to stay. I shouldn't have. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. I sat closer to it, rifle within arm's reach. I wasn't letting my guard down this time. And sure enough, not long after the sun went down, I heard it. Footsteps. Not an animal. Not a deer, not a bear. Something walking. Slow. Careful. Close. I gripped my rifle, staring into the dark, but my fire only lit up so much. I couldn't see beyond the first few rows of trees. Then silence. I don't know what was worse, the sound or the way it just stopped. I stayed up for hours watching, listening. The woods felt different, heavier. The air felt thick, like something was pressing in on me. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. Not to a noise, to silence. The fire had burned low. The woods were too quiet. No wind. No insects. Nothing. And then, just outside the glow of the fire, ***, movement ***. A shadow, tall, human-shaped, standing between the trees. I went still, barely breathing. My hands clenched around my rifle. The shadow didn't move, just stood there, watching. Then it took a step forward. That broke me. I grabbed my rifle, chambered around, and aimed. My finger rested on the trigger. Move, I thought. Move, and I swear to God. The shadow stepped back. Then it was gone. I didn't sleep after that. Didn't move. Just sat there waiting for morning. As soon as the sun rose, I packed up. Fast. I didn't even eat. Just shoved everything in my bag and started hiking. The whole way back to my truck, I felt it. That pressure. That feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I swore I heard footsteps behind me, but I never turned around. I just kept walking. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't stop driving until I was home. I don't know who or what I saw that night. Person? Maybe. But what kind of person stands in the dark, watching without saying a word? I haven't been camping alone since, and I never will again. That was one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. I don't tell the story often because most people don't believe me, but I know what I saw, and I know I was not alone in those woods. I don't know why I agreed to it. Maybe I was just trying to prove something to myself. Maybe I thought it would be a good story to tell later, a way to make my life feel less routine. I never really believed in anything supernatural, but I've always had this deep respect for places that hold history, especially the kind of history that most people don't want to think about. Graveyards fall into that category. It started with a simple idea: camp overnight in an old graveyard just outside of town. It wasn't one of those well-kept cemeteries with trimmed grass and neat little rows of stones. This one was different. It sat on the edge of a small wooded area, long forgotten by anyone except the occasional vandal or unlucky passerby. The graves were old, the names on the stones barely visible under layers of moss and grime. Some of the headstones leaned at odd angles, their bases sinking into the earth over time. The last recorded burial had been decades ago, and by now, most people didn't even acknowledge that it existed. I packed light, a small tent, a flashlight, a bottle of water, and a knife. Not because I expected to need it, but because it felt stupid not to bring one. The hike out there was uneventful, just a long walk along an overgrown path that barely resembled a trail anymore. The further I got from the road, the quieter everything became. The air felt thicker, and the usual background noise of distant cars and buzzing streetlights disappeared entirely. By the time I reached the graveyard, the sun was starting to set. The last bit of light cast long shadows across the uneven ground, making the headstones look even more twisted and misshapen than they already were. I set up my tent near the edge of the cemetery, close to the trees. I didn't want to sleep directly among the graves. Even if I didn't believe in anything supernatural, it just felt wrong. As night settled in, the temperature dropped fast. I zipped up my jacket and sat just outside my tent, listening. The forest was alive with small sounds, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the occasional chirp of some night insect. But the graveyard itself felt silent. Unnaturally so. No wind moved through the trees. No animals scurried through the underbrush. It was just still. I ate a protein bar, drank some water, and checked my phone. No service. Not surprising, but still annoying. I put it away and decided to walk around a little before turning in for the night. My flashlight beam swept over the graves, revealing names and dates long past relevance. Some of the stones had crumbled into little more than piles of rock. Others still stood, their inscriptions barely legible. I came across one that caught my eye. It was a simple stone, not very large, but something about it seemed off. The dirt around it looked disturbed, not fresh, but like it had been moved at some point and never fully settled back into place. I crouched down, running my fingers over the loose soil. Probably just an animal digging, I told myself, but it didn't look like the kind of hole an animal would make. It looked like someone had tried to dig something up. The thought sat heavy in my mind as I made my way back to my tent. I zipped myself inside, clicked off my flashlight, and lay down. The silence pressed in from all sides. Every tiny sound felt amplified, like the whole world had gone still except for whatever was out there, just beyond the thin fabric of my tent. I don't know when I fell asleep, but I woke up suddenly, my body on high alert. Something had changed. I listened, holding my breath. Then I heard it, a faint shuffling sound. Not from the woods, not from the road, from the graveyard. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay still, straining to hear more. The sound wasn't steady, came in short bursts like someone taking a few slow steps, stopping, then moving again. I reached for my knife, gripping the handle tightly. Then silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Minutes passed. Nothing. Just when I started convincing myself that I had imagined it, a new sound cut through the quiet. A sharp, distinct thud, like something heavy hitting the ground. It was close, too close. I forced myself to move, slowly unzipping my tent just enough to peek outside. My flashlight was in my other hand, ready to flick on the second I needed it. I scanned the graveyard, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. Nothing. Then I saw it. A grave. One I hadn't noticed before, with a wooden marker instead of stone. The dirt around it had been disturbed, the same way as the one I saw earlier. But this time it was worse. The ground had been pushed up from below. My stomach dropped. Something had been dug up, or something had dug itself out. I don't remember making the decision to move, but I was suddenly out of my tent, gripping my flashlight with one hand and my knife with the other. My breath came fast, my ears ringing with my own heartbeat. Then I saw the footprints, deep, fresh prints in the soft dirt, leading away from the disturbed grave, leading toward the trees, toward my tent. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the area with my flashlight. Nothing moved, but I knew I wasn't alone. A snapping sound came from the tree line. I spun toward it, shining my light into the woods. For a split second, I saw something. Not clearly, just the faintest hint of movement, something shifting in the shadows. Then it was gone. That was enough for me. I didn't bother packing up my tent. I grabbed my bag and ran. I didn't stop to look back. I didn't care what was behind me. I just needed to get out of there. By the time I reached the road, my legs felt like they would give out. I didn't stop until I was in my car, doors locked, hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life and I drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if anything was watching me. The next day, I convinced myself that I had imagined most of it. Sleep deprivation, paranoia, tricks of the light. But something still didn't sit right. A week later, I went back in the daylight. Not alone this time. I brought a friend, someone I trusted. We found the grave I had seen that night. The wooden marker was still there. The disturbed dirt was still there. But the footprints were gone. And the grave, it was filled back in, like nothing had ever happened. I haven't gone back since. I was looking for somewhere quiet, away from the city. Work had been draining me, and I wanted to clear my head. I had a friend, Daniel, who owned a farm out in the countryside. It wasn't a big commercial farm, just some land his family had kept for generations. He didn't live there full-time, but he visited on weekends to keep it maintained. When I mentioned wanting to camp somewhere peaceful, he offered me a spot on his land. "It's quiet out there," he had said. "No traffic, no noise, just fields and trees." That was exactly what I wanted. The farm was in a rural part of Pennsylvania, about a 3-hour drive from my place. It had been in Daniel's family for years, but they didn't do much with it anymore. His grandfather had raised cattle there, but after he passed, the family slowly let the farming go. Now it was mostly empty fields, a few wooded patches, and an old barn that was falling apart. There was a small cabin on the land, but I wanted to camp out in the open. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and my knife. I liked the idea of being away from everything for a few nights, just me and nature. I arrived in the late afternoon. The dirt road leading to the farm was rough, with weeds growing between the tire tracks. There was no proper driveway, just a path that cut through the fields. The land stretched for miles, nothing but tall grass and scattered trees. The barn was the first thing I saw. It was old, leaning slightly to one side. The wood was gray from years of sun and rain. Near it was the small cabin, barely more than a shed. Daniel had told me it was still sturdy, but I didn't plan to stay inside. I parked near the barn and walked the property. The air smelled like damp earth. The fields were overgrown, the grass reaching my waist in some places. There were no animals, no livestock, just the quiet rustling of the wind. I picked a spot near the edge of the property, where a patch of trees created a natural barrier from the road. Felt secluded, hidden. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and ate a quick meal. The sun was starting to set, the sky turning orange and pink. As night fell, the silence settled in. No distant hum of cars, no voices, just the occasional chirp of crickets. It was peaceful. I stayed by the fire for a while, watching the flames dance. After a while, I crawled into my tent and lay down. Then I heard it, a rustling noise, not the wind, something moving through the grass. I held my breath, listening. It was faint but steady. Slow steps. Something or someone was walking nearby. I sat up, my hand reaching for my knife. My fire had burned low, casting only a weak glow. I listened. The sound stopped. I stayed still, straining my ears. Nothing, just the breeze through the trees. Maybe an animal, a deer maybe. I lay back down, but I kept my knife close. The silence felt different now, heavier. I must have drifted off at some point because I woke up to another noise. This time it was closer. Footsteps, right outside my tent. Not an animal. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps were soft, careful. Someone was walking just inches from where I lay. I gripped my knife. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, deliberate. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. Then, after what felt like forever, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. I couldn't hear anything but the wind. I slowly sat up, my hand shaking around the knife. I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. Darkness. I scanned the area. My fire was just glowing embers now. The trees stood still. Nothing moved, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. I stepped out slowly, knife in hand. The air was cold against my skin. I turned, looking in every direction. Then I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the tall grass to my tent. Human footprints. They circled my tent twice, then disappeared back into the field. Someone had been here, watching me. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the darkness. Nothing. I listened for any sound, but there was only the wind. I backed toward my tent, never taking my eyes off the field. My mind raced. Should I pack up and leave? But where would I go? The nearest town was miles away. I couldn't just sit in my tent and wait. I made a decision. I would stay up until sunrise. Whatever was out there, I wouldn't give it a chance to catch me off guard. I added more wood to the fire, letting the flames grow. The light felt like protection. I sat with my knife in my lap, staring into the dark. The night stretched on. I didn't hear any more footsteps, but I never felt alone. Finally, the sky began to lighten, the first signs of dawn. I forced myself to wait until the sun was fully up before stepping away from the fire. I checked the ground again. The footprints were still there, and something else, a set of footprints leading back toward the barn. Whoever it was had been hiding on the property. I needed to leave. I packed up quickly, throwing everything into my truck. As I turned to leave, I glanced back at the barn. The door was open. It had been closed when I arrived. I didn't check inside. I didn't want to know. I got into my truck and left, driving fast down the dirt road. I never went back. A week later, Daniel called me. "Did you see anything weird out there?" he asked. I hesitated. "Why?" "Someone broke into the cabin. Didn't take anything, just stayed there. Found a sleeping bag inside. Some empty food cans." I swallowed hard. "When?" "Don't know. Could have been recent. Could have been there for weeks." I didn't say anything. "Maybe next time," Daniel said. "Pick a different place to camp." I didn't need to be told twice. I never went back to that farm. I don't know why I agreed to that trip. Maybe it was the constant pressure at work, the same dull routine every day, the sound of ringing phones and clicking keyboards echoing in my head even when I was home. I thought a break would help. A weekend away with the team. No work, no customers, just nature. It was late September, the kind of weather where the air had a bite to it at night, but during the day you could still feel the leftover warmth of summer. Someone from the office, maybe Mike or Daniel, I can't remember now, had suggested we go camping. A bonding trip, they called it. Most of the team was on board. Even the branch manager, Robert, decided to come along. We were a mix of people, some young, some older, all just looking to get away from the constant stress of balancing accounts and handling impatient customers. We decided on a spot a few hours outside the city, a camping area near a forest. It wasn't one of those designated campsites with facilities and marked trails. It was more remote. Someone knew someone who had been there before, said it was a great place, peaceful. We packed up our gear, loaded into cars, and headed out on a Friday evening. By the time we arrived, the sun was already low in the sky. The drive had been long, the last stretch on rough, uneven roads. We parked on a small clearing off the road and walked the rest of the way with our backpacks. The forest was dense, dark even before the sun had fully set. Tall trees, thick undergrowth, no sign of other people around. Setting up camp took longer than expected. The ground was hard, and the air was getting colder. Someone struggled with the tents. Another person fumbled with the firewood. There was a lot of laughing, some frustration, but we managed. The fire was finally lit, flickering shadows dancing across the trees. We sat around, eating, drinking, unwinding from the week. Stories were shared, some funny, some about work, a few about past camping trips. The sounds of the forest were all around us. Crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional distant call of an animal. It should have been peaceful, but something felt off. I didn't notice it at first. Maybe it was just the unease of being so far from civilization, but I kept glancing over my shoulder. The darkness beyond the fire felt heavier than it should have. The trees seemed too still. At some point, Robert got up to grab something from his tent. A minute passed, then another. Someone made a joke about him getting lost. More time went by. "Should we check on him?" someone finally said. I stood up, shined my flashlight toward the tents. "Robert." No response. I walked toward his tent, the leaves crunching beneath my boots. The flap was unzipped, hanging open. His bag was there, half unpacked. But he wasn't. A few of us spread out, calling his name, scanning the area with flashlights. The forest swallowed our voices. I told myself he must have just wandered off to relieve himself. He'd be back, but he wasn't. Minutes passed, stretching into half an hour. The mood shifted. The laughter and easy conversation from earlier were gone. We weren't just a group of co-workers anymore. We were a group of people suddenly realizing how alone we were out there. We split up into pairs, flashlights cutting through the dark. I was with Daniel, walking along a narrow trail near the trees. The deeper we went, the more the forest felt wrong. The air was too still, the usual sounds of nighttime animals absent. Every snap of a branch underfoot made me flinch. And then we found it. Not Robert, but something. A backpack. Not his, someone else's. It looked old, weathered, left behind. I crouched down, shined my light over it. The fabric was torn in places. There was dirt on it, dried mud. I unzipped it carefully, half expecting to find, I don't even know. Inside, there were a few crumpled clothes, a rusted canteen, an old flashlight, but no sign of who it belonged to. Daniel muttered something under his breath. He was staring at the trees, his face pale. I followed his gaze. There, nailed into the bark of a tree, was a shirt. Not just hung there, but nailed. The fabric was shredded, faded with time. It looked like it had been there for years. We backed away fast. We weren't alone out there. The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. We weren't alone. We rushed back to the campsite, breathless. The others could see it on our faces. Something was wrong. Then, from the other side of the camp, someone shouted. Another one of us, Laura, had found something. A shoe. Robert's shoe. Not far from it, the ground was disturbed. Grass flattened, dirt kicked up, like there had been a struggle. I don't remember who said it first. We need to leave, but we didn't know where to go. The cars were a long walk back. The forest was thick, the trails winding. And if Robert was still out there, could we just leave him? No one wanted to say it, but we all thought the same thing. He wasn't coming back. Not in the way we wanted. The night stretched on. We stayed close to the fire, flashlights in hand, listening. Every sound made my heart race. The snapping of a twig, the rustle of leaves. Was it the wind, an animal, or something else? At some point, exhaustion took over. Some of us dozed off in shifts while the rest kept watch. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light crept through the trees, we packed up faster than I thought possible. No one spoke much. No one wanted to be the last one left behind. We hiked back to the cars in tense silence, glancing over our shoulders, half expecting to see something following us. But we never did. We reported Robert missing. The search teams went out, combed the area for days. They never found him.
No trace.
No body. Nothing. Just a campsite abandoned in a forest that felt too quiet. I haven't gone camping since. I always loved hunting. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the silence, the patience, the way the forest swallowed me whole. I grew up with a rifle in my hands, learning from my father and uncles, spending more time in the woods than in my own house. There was a comfort to it, a feeling of control in an otherwise chaotic life. That's why, when I finally got a week off work, I packed my gear and drove out to a spot I'd been meaning to hunt for years. It was deep in the woods, a few hours from the nearest town, just past a series of old logging trails that most people had forgotten about. I had heard from an old friend that the deer population was good out there, and best of all, no other hunters. Just me, my rifle, and the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sun already dipping below the trees. The air smelled like damp leaves and fresh pine, and the wind had a sharp edge to it, the kind that told me the temperature would drop fast once night came. I parked my truck at the end of the trail, strapped on my pack, and hiked in about a mile until I found a good clearing to set up camp. The first thing I did was get my tent up. I always brought a sturdy one, something that could handle the cold. I laid out my sleeping bag inside, then built a fire pit a few yards away. Once that was done, I pulled my rifle from its case, checked the scope, and made sure everything was ready for the morning hunt. As the fire crackled, I sat on a log, eating a quick meal of jerky and trail mix. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Normally, I'd hear the distant call of an owl, the rustling of small creatures in the underbrush, maybe even the howl of a coyote. But that night, the only sound was the wind moving through the trees. I didn't think much of it. Sometimes the forest just had an eerie stillness to it. I doused the fire, crawled into my tent, and fell asleep within minutes. I woke up before sunrise, as I always did when hunting. The air inside the tent was freezing, and when I stepped outside, my breath hung in thick clouds. I made a quick cup of coffee on my small camp stove, ate a protein bar, and then grabbed my rifle. The plan was simple: find a good spot, set up, and wait. I moved through the trees as quietly as I could, keeping my steps light, watching for any movement. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, and every step made a soft crunching sound. About 30 minutes in, I found a good spot near a small clearing. I settled in behind some brush, using it as cover, and waited. An hour passed, then two. Nothing. It was strange. Normally, by now, I would have at least seen movement. But the woods were still. No birds, no squirrels, no deer. Just the wind. I stayed put for another hour before finally giving up. I stood, stretched, and decided to head deeper into the woods. Maybe they were further in. As I moved, I started to feel off, like I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia. I'd spent too much time in the woods for that. This was different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut told me something wasn't right. I stopped and listened. Nothing, just the wind. I pushed forward, forcing myself to ignore it. Then I found the tracks. At first, I thought they were from a deer, but as I knelt down, I realized they were different. Larger, heavier, and they weren't shaped like hooves, they looked like boots. Someone else was out here. That wasn't too strange on its own. Hunters sometimes wandered onto other people's spots, but what bothered me was that the tracks looked fresh, yet I hadn't heard a single shot all morning. I followed them. The tracks led me deeper into the woods, past an area I hadn't planned to go. Eventually, I saw something through the trees, a structure, a cabin. It wasn't on any of the maps I'd looked at before coming here, which was odd. It looked old, the wood dark and weathered, but it wasn't abandoned. There was a faint wisp of smoke coming from the chimney. I crouched low, watching. No movement, Something about it made me uneasy. The way it sat there, hidden deep in the woods, like it wasn't meant to be found. Then I saw something else. The tracks didn't just lead to the cabin. They circled it, multiple times. That's when I realized something was really wrong. These weren't just the tracks of someone heading to their cabin. They were the tracks of someone walking around it over and over, watching. I turned and left, moving quickly but quietly back the way I came. I didn't care about the hunt anymore. Something wasn't right here, and I wasn't about to find out the hard way. As I made my way back to camp, that feeling of being watched got stronger. Every few minutes, I stopped, turned, scanned the trees. Nothing, but I knew someone was there. I finally reached my camp and immediately started packing. I wasn't staying another night. As I threw my gear into my pack, I heard it, a branch snapping, close. I froze, my hand on my rifle. Slowly, I turned my head. Nothing, just the trees. I scanned the area for another minute before forcing myself to move. I slung my pack over my shoulder, grabbed my rifle, and started walking. I made it about 50 yards before I saw them. A figure, standing between the trees, half hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, just standing, watching. I raised my rifle, not aiming, but making it clear I saw them. They didn't react. I took a step back. The figure shifted slightly, just enough for me to see their face. It was wrong. Their skin looked stretched too tight, their eyes wide, unblinking, and they were smiling. Not a normal smile, something else, something off. I turned and walked away, fast. I didn't run. I knew better than that. But I moved as quickly as I could without making it obvious I was panicking. I made it to my truck, threw my gear in the back, and climbed inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life. I put it in reverse, backing up onto the trail, then slammed it into drive and sped off. As I drove, I looked in the rearview mirror. The figure was standing at the edge of the trees, still watching, still smiling. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back on the main road, heading straight for town. I never went back to that spot, never tried to find out who or what I had seen. Some places aren't meant to be found, and some people aren't meant to be out there. I had been planning the trip for weeks, a solo camping trip deep into the woods of northern Montana. I wanted to be alone, to clear my head, to get away from work, from people, from everything. I wasn't new to this. I had camped all my life, grew up hunting, fishing, hiking. The wilderness was my second home, and I figured a few nights away would do me some good. I packed everything I needed: my tent, sleeping bag, enough food and water for 3 days, a good knife, my rifle, extra ammo, a compass, a map, and a first aid kit. I kept my phone with me, though I knew there wouldn't be any service where I was going. I wanted the isolation. The deep woods had always given me peace, a place where the world felt simple again. The drive out was long, a mix of winding roads and dirt trails that eventually led me to an old, rarely used logging road. I followed it for miles until I reached a spot where I felt comfortable leaving my truck behind. There wasn't a soul in sight, just miles of thick forest and nothing else. That's exactly what I wanted. I grabbed my pack, locked the truck, and started walking. The air was crisp, the smell of pine heavy in the air. I followed an old game trail, weaving my way deeper into the woods. I had studied the area on a map before coming. There was a stream about 3 miles in, a perfect place to set up camp. I reached it after about an hour. It was perfect. The stream was clear, flowing steady, a good source of water. The trees were thick, offering plenty of cover. I found a small clearing just off the bank and set up my tent. I took my time gathering firewood, making sure I had enough to last the night. I set up a perimeter, marked my surroundings. The first rule of solo camping is knowing your area, where your exits are, where the high ground is, what's around you. I had always been cautious, always aware. The first night was calm. I cooked some food over the fire, sat back, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The wind through the trees, the distant call of an owl, the occasional rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful. I stayed up for a while, watching the fire, letting my thoughts drift. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I wasn't sure why at first. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The woods were quiet, too quiet. I listened. Nothing. No wind, no insects, no movement. That wasn't normal. The forest never went silent like that unless something was wrong. I reached for my rifle, keeping it close as I sat up, scanning the darkness. My headlamp was in my pack, but I didn't want to use it yet. My eyes had adjusted to the dark, and I didn't want to lose that. I stayed still, listening. A few minutes passed, then a sound. It was faint, just a slight rustling, but it was close, maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the tree line. I strained my eyes, trying to see through the dark, but there was nothing. Could have been an animal, but the way the forest had gone quiet, I wasn't sure. I sat there for a long time, rifle in hand, waiting. The silence stretched on. Eventually, I heard the normal sounds of the woods again. The wind, the insects, the distant hoot of an owl. Whatever it was, it had moved on. I stayed awake until dawn. The next morning, I checked the area. I found tracks near my camp. Fresh. Human. That wasn't right. I was miles from the nearest road, deep in the woods where no one should be. The tracks weren't mine. They were smaller, lighter. Someone had been near my camp, watching. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared into the thicker brush. I didn't like it. I had never run into another person this deep in the woods before. I decided to stay one more night, but I kept my rifle loaded and close. That day, I stayed near camp, keeping an eye on my surroundings. I didn't see anything out of place, but that feeling stuck with me, the sense that I wasn't alone out there. That night, I built the fire bigger, hoping it would keep anything or anyone away. But that didn't stop it from happening again. I woke up same as the night before. The fire was low, the woods silent. But this time I heard breathing. It was close, slow, steady breathing. Someone was standing just outside my tent. I gripped my rifle, my heart pounding. I listened. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps shifting on the dirt, the slow inhale and exhale of someone just beyond the thin layer of fabric separating me from the dark. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then the breathing stopped. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps retreating, moving away from my tent. They were slow, careful. Whoever it was, they were trying not to make noise. I stayed like that for hours, rifle in my hands, listening to the forest. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. To first light, I packed up. I didn't eat, didn't take my time. I just packed everything, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and started walking back toward my truck. I moved fast, kept my head on a swivel. I checked my back every few steps. The feeling of being watched never went away. The whole way back, I never saw anyone. When I finally reached my truck, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. I threw my gear into the back, locked the doors, and started the engine. I was ready to get the hell out of there. As I turned onto the logging road, I looked in my rearview mirror. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the tree line, not moving, just watching. I didn't stop, didn't slow down. I kept driving, putting as much distance between me and that place as I could. I never went back. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods. There was something about it, The quiet, the stillness, the feeling of being far away from everything. It was a way to clear my head, to get away from the noise of everyday life. I'd gone on solo camping trips plenty of times before, and I never thought twice about it. This time was no different. I had a weekend off, and I decided to take my gear and head out to a spot I had been to before, deep in the mountains. It wasn't a well-known campsite, just a clearing by a small river, with a fire pit I had built myself on a previous trip. It was far enough from any towns that I didn't have to worry about running into people. That was the whole point. I packed up my truck on a Friday morning, making sure I had everything: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a knife, a hatchet, and my rifle. I wasn't a hunter, but I always brought it on trips like this. There were bears in the area, and I didn't want to take any chances. The drive took a few hours. Most of it was on paved roads, but the last stretch was a rough dirt path that wound up through the trees. I had to take it slow, steering carefully over rocks and ruts, but eventually, I made it to the clearing. It was just as I remembered. The river was running strong, and the trees were thick and green. There was no sign that anyone else had been there recently. No trash, no tracks, nothing. Perfect. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to the river that I could hear the water, but far enough that I didn't have to worry about flooding. Then I gathered firewood, built a small fire, and cooked myself a meal. The first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, listened to the sounds of the forest, and enjoyed the peace and quiet. It got cold after the sun went down, but I had plenty of layers. I slept well. The next morning, I woke up early, made some coffee over the fire, and decided to go for a hike. There were miles of forest in every direction, and I liked exploring. I took my rifle with me, just in case, and set off into the trees. I walked for a few hours, not following any particular path, just wandering. I saw deer, birds, and a few old fallen trees covered in moss. Everything was normal until I found the footprints. They were fresh, too fresh. The dirt was still loose around the edges, like someone had stepped there just a little while ago. They weren't mine. They were bigger than my boots, and they went in a straight line through the trees. At first, I thought it might have been another camper, but that didn't make sense. There were no other campsites nearby, and the tracks didn't look like someone out for a hike. They were too direct, too purposeful. I followed them for a little while, but after a few minutes, I felt uneasy. Something about them didn't sit right with me. They were heading in the general direction of my campsite. I turned around and went back. When I got to my camp, nothing looked out of place. My tent was still zipped up. My firewood pile was untouched, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I spent the rest of the day close to camp, keeping my rifle nearby. I didn't see anyone. That night, I built my fire bigger than before. The light made me feel safer. I sat up late, listening to the woods, but I didn't hear anything unusual. Eventually, I went to bed. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something was moving outside my tent. I lay still, listening. It was slow, careful, like someone trying to be quiet. I reached for my rifle, moving as little as possible. The sound stopped. I held my breath. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A slow, deliberate step in the dirt. I sat up quickly and unzipped the tent, rifle in my hands. My fire had burned down to embers, but there was enough light to see movement at the edge of the clearing. A man. He was standing just inside the tree line, half hidden by the darkness. He was tall, thin, wearing dark clothes. I couldn't see his face. He didn't move. I raised my rifle. He still didn't move. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to break the silence. I just stared at him, waiting for him to do something. Finally, after what felt like forever, he turned and walked back into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the fire, feeding it more wood, keeping my rifle in my lap. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up my gear, loaded everything into my truck, and got the hell out of there. On the way back down the dirt road, I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. I never saw him again, but I never went back to that spot either.